All right, welcome to the Book of Romans. I'll be your teacher, Dr. Benjamin Olson. In this first video, we're just going to look at the introduction to the Book of Romans. We're going to look at its date of writing, its composition, the authorship, the structure of the book. We're going to be looking at the original audience, the purpose of its writing, and finally we're going to look at the outline of the book. And all of these things are going to be vitally important for our understanding of the Book of Romans. First, I want to just start with a bit of an introduction. The book of Romans is perhaps the most important book of the entire Bible. I can't say that without also recognizing, obviously, the entire Bible is important, since the entire Bible is the inspired revelation of God to mankind. But the book of Romans, the doctrine that is presented in the book of Romans, has been used by God throughout the two centuries of church history to bring about revival after revival after revival. The Protestant Reformation, most of the major doctrinal movements throughout church history have been because someone took the book of Romans seriously. This is how important the book of Romans is, and your understanding of the book of Romans. It's also one of the most misunderstood books in the entire Bible. Not because people fail to understand doctrine of salvation by grace through faith. That's obviously presented very clearly in the very first theme statement in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation, to the Jews first, and also to the Greeks. We get that. But major portions of the book of Romans, particularly Romans 9, 10, and 11, have been used and abused by by theologians to promote personal vendettas or personal theologies that don't fit the text. And what our job is to look at what does the Bible truly say. As I showed in the introduction to this course, that we're going to be looking at an exposition of the book of Romans. We're going to see what Paul had to say to the Roman believers, and vicariously what that means to us today. With that being said, let's jump into the book of Romans. First, we start with the authorship of the book of Romans. It's pretty obvious that the Apostle Paul wrote it. Internal evidence is obvious because the very first word of the book is Paul. And you really can't have a book by Paul that doesn't start with Paul. In fact, all 13 of Paul's epistles begin with his own name. So that, just starting off with, internally, it was obvious Paul wrote it. Externally, however, there's just as much evidence for Pauline authorship. In fact, Paul, being the author of Romans, is undisputed among any critical scholars. The evidence has been overwhelming in critical scholarship in favor of Pauline authorship of the letter. Once Pauline authorship is accepted for works like Galatians and the Corinthian letters, then a work like Romans may also be ascribed to Pauline authorship, since the topics are so similar and there are no substantial difficulties. In fact, Romans, along with Galatians and 1 Corinthians and Ephesians, creates what's called the Pauline canon. That means that essentially the person who wrote Romans is Paul. However you define Paul, it's the author of Romans. Much like you would say, who wrote Romeo and Juliet? Shakespeare did. There's no other person to have written Romeo and Juliet. In fact, Shakespeare is defined as the man who wrote Romeo and Juliet. All right, that being said, let's continue on then. Some have tried to deny Pauline authorship, but there are no more, within the mainstream of scholarship, no one seriously disputes the authorship anymore. Some consider Tertius to have composed Romans in accordance with Paul's instructions. Romans 16:22 says that Tertius was the amanuensis, However, it's more likely probable that Tertius was Paul's secretary or amanuensis who either wrote the letter in longhand from Paul's dictation, or who first took Paul's letter in shorthand and then wrote it out in longhand with Paul's final approval. Either way, Paul is still considered to be the author because it comes from his mind, even if it didn't come from his actual pen. The date and circumstances of writing the book, vitally important. We put a date of the winter of AD 56 to 57 from Corinth. This is in the book of Acts, just before Paul departs Corinth to go back to Jerusalem to fulfill an oath and to deliver the promised offering to the Jerusalem church. Just before he is arrested and put in prison for 2 years in Caesarea under Felix and Festus. So it's somewhere right around Acts 19 and 20. The relative chronology, Romans was probably written during Paul's third missionary journey, or toward the end of Paul's third missionary journey from Corinth. Much of this is dependent on on chapters 15 and 16 being authentic to the book, which we'll get to in a minute. The letter was written when Paul was about to set out for Jerusalem. We see that in chapter 15, verse 25. Paul also considers himself to have completed his missionary work among the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire in chapter 15, verses 19 to 23. Therefore, the journey is most probably the one recorded in Acts 20 and 21, which begins from Corinth in Acts chapter 19, verse 21, and continues through Miletus, where he greets the Ephesian elders, and then on to Jerusalem in chapter 20. Paul desired to go to Rome. We see that in chapter 1, verses 10 through 13, but had been prevented from doing so. Again, we see that in 1:13 and also 15:22. Now he hopes to go there on his way to Spain. In chapter 15, verses 23 to 28, he indicates his desire to go to Spain. But first, he is going to Jerusalem with the offering for the poor from the Gentile churches in Jerusalem, the believers in Jerusalem. Therefore, in view of Paul's setting, Corinth seems to be the place from which Paul originally wrote the letter. Other indications that Paul wrote from Corinth are that in 16:1 and 2, Paul commends Phoebe to them, probably the person who carried the letter to the Romans from Corinth, and she is a servant of the church at Cenchrea, which is in the Isthmus of Achaia, just south of the city of Corinth. Paul also sends greetings from Gaius, in whose house he is staying, who may well have been the same Gaius mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:14 as the one who Paul baptized in Corinth that we see in chapter 16, verse 23 of Romans. The greeting from Erastus, the city treasurer, may have been the Erastus who stayed in Corinth in Acts 19:22, also mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:20. So all of those ancillary things leading up to the fact that Paul wrote from Corinth. A more absolute chronology, Paul probably wrote Romans between AD 56 and 57. He seems to have stood before Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, in the summer of AD 51 in his second missionary journey. We can see that as we date the book of Acts. After staying many days in Corinth in Acts 18:18, Paul set out for Syria and remained some time in Ephesus, perhaps early fall AD 52, which would have been Acts 19, 21. Paul then returned to Caesarea, went down to Jerusalem, and then up to the church in Antioch, where he spent some time, perhaps late fall AD 52, through the winter of 52-53, which is recorded in Acts 18:22 to 23. Paul then begins his third missionary journey from Antioch through the Galatian region, summer of AD 53, and reached Ephesus in the fall of AD 53, where he remained for 2 to 3 years. That's where we kind of get a little wonky in our numbers. So AD 53 perhaps to 56. Therefore, Paul's return to Corinth through Macedonia was probably in the spring or summer of AD 56, which is recorded for us in Acts 20, verses 2 through 3. and which means probably Paul arrived in Corinth late fall of AD 56 and remained through early 57. Therefore, Romans, which was written from Corinth on the third missionary journey, was probably written in the winter, perhaps early spring of AD 56 or AD 57. The destination was the church at Rome. Again, pretty obvious from the beginning of the letter. But more specifically, it's to the Jews and Gentiles of the church at Rome. There was an early church in Rome, possibly before AD 49. There was certainly a church already in Rome when Paul wrote the book, since he's writing to believers in Rome. There has to be believers in Rome in order for him to write to them. From a statement by Suetonius, there may be evidence that Christianity was in the capital city by early AD 49. The church may well have been started through converts of Paul who lived in Rome. Obviously, since all roads led to Rome, lots of people migrating to the city of Rome, to and from the city of Rome, which we'll see here in just a little bit, perhaps in the next video, rather than through any particular evangelistic effort, since neither Paul nor Luke or any other New Testament document mentions any evangelistic effort in Rome. This is contrary to the Roman Catholic Church, which states that Peter established the church at Rome. This cannot be further from the truth, because Peter only went to Rome right at the very end of his life, just before he was martyred in AD 68, well after Paul wrote the book of Romans, well after Paul was there on his during his first Roman imprisonment, where he certainly established the church by then. The composition of the church at Rome was mixed, both Jewish and Gentile. In fact, this becomes the central problem in the book of Romans, which we'll come to in just a little bit. Rather than one large church, the Romans seem to have been made up. Roman church seemed to have been made up of at least 5 household churches. There are 5 different households greeted in chapter 16. And Paul does not address the letter to the church at Rome, but rather to all that are in Rome, meaning that because Rome was such a large city, there very likely could have been, and probably were, many different house churches that were really under one Roman church banner. He was writing to all of them, regardless of where they actually attended together, but this was very common to many of Paul's churches, like in Ephesus or Corinth. The Romans were made up of both Jews and Gentiles, with a probable emphasis on the Gentiles. This is the first time that we really see the Gentiles taking the leadership in a church rather than Jews. And this is going to become, like I said, the essential problem, central problem in the book of Romans. We see that Paul writes specifically to the Gentiles. He says he was an apostle to the Gentiles in chapter 1, verse 5. He speaks to Gentiles directly who receive mercy through Jewish unbelief. In chapter 11, he compares the Romans with other Gentiles, not just Gentiles, in chapter 1, verses 12 through 14. Paul refers to the Jews as my brethren as compared to our brethren. And out of the 24 names in chapter 16, over half are in either Latin or Greek. But Paul also addresses the Jews in Rome as well. Paul wrote with many references to the Old Testament. Paul speaks of Abraham as our father, chapter 2, verse 1. And in chapters 9 through 11 are about the nation of Israel. But they show that those who had privilege could end up losing it, i.e. the Jews, which they had at this time in Rome. And Paul describes this Jewish-Gentile problem in chapter 12 as the weak versus the strong. The weak believers versus the strong believers. That's in chapter 14. So let's finish up this video here. We're already at about 15 minutes in. So let's go ahead and stop this video, move on to the next video where we'll talk about the integrity of the book of Romans, the structure of the book of Romans, the purpose of the book of Romans, and head on into that outline.